Hello, welcome to CrossCurrents, produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Barbara Rutstein, the moderator for today's program. The views expressed on this program are solely those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the City of Fort Collins Television, the City of Fort Collins, or the Larimer County League of Women Voters. Our topic is what's happening to the death penalty in Colorado? Some of you may wonder why we are having a discussion on the death penalty now, because it does not appear to be a current hot topic. However, because of the November election resulting in a Democratic majority in the Colorado House Senator and a Democratic governor, we suspect that the issue will be high on the next legislative agenda. 20 states have banned the death penalty, and 30 states allow it. Colorado last executed a man in 1997, and we now have 3 inmates on death row. In 2009 and in 2013, the Colorado General Assembly came close to passing bills abolishing the death penalty. Another bill was introduced in 2017, but it too failed to pass. The same bill, or a very similar one, may be introduced again with the hope that it can gain some bipartisan support for abolishing the death penalty. To discuss some of the important issues involved, we have a panel that is very well versed in the debate. On my right is Troy Krenning, a criminal defense lawyer. On his right is Kevin Lundberg, state senator from District 15. On his right is Michael Radelet, professor of sociology from the University of Colorado Boulder. And on his right is Clifford Riedel, district attorney of the Eighth Judicial District. Welcome to you and to our audience and to our viewing audience. I gave a very abbreviated status of the death penalty in our state, but I wonder what more you can add. Who would like to go first? Cliff?
Well, I would say the status of the death penalty in Colorado is it's on death row. I believe that, and I don't believe that a Democratic governor coming in is going to give it an indefinite reprieve. So I believe there will be legislation, and like I say, I believe the death penalty will be abolished in Colorado, is my belief.
Okay. Michael?
We've had now 103 executions in the history of the state of Colorado. We've had 1 execution in the last 50 years, and we'll get into some of the issues, but one of the issues is that whenever there's a death penalty case, it costs bundles of money for all the efforts put in by investigators, prosecutors, defense attorneys. And one of the real questions that we face today is how could that money be better used? For example, in our state, it's shocking to say this, 40% of homicides aren't even solved. So if we abolished the death penalty and took just a portion of the cost savings and investigated it and invested it in cold case investigations, we would be doing a much better job helping families of homicide victims.
Okay. Kevin?
Well, I quite agree with our district attorney that it probably will be abolished this year by the incoming legislature, and I find that unfortunate. I also have to take issue with anyone who reduces this to a dollars and cents decision, because sure, and I'm a fiscal hawk, have been for the last 16 years down in the legislature, and yes, I want to see us balance the budget and find the funds for the priorities we have, but the discussion shouldn't revolve around how much money it costs. The discussion should revolve around 2 elements. One is justice. Are there some crimes for which this is truly the appropriate justice to be meted out? And secondly is the very practical consideration of, without the death penalty, can prosecutors do their job in following through with the prosecution of these most heinous crimes, and it is the very worst of the worst, with only 3 people on death row today and only 1 actual execution in the last 50 years here in Colorado.
Okay, let's see what a defense attorney has to say.
Well, as you might imagine, I agree with Cliff. The death penalty in Colorado probably is barely on life support. As has been pointed out, since 1967, there's only been 1 person executed in the state of Colorado. Compare that to the number of homicides that have occurred at 8,100. So it's rarely used, and when it is used, it's rarely carried out. One of the things I come in tonight, I wanted to make a point, and I'm going to try to do it early before we get into too much of a robust conversation here. But I'd like to know how many people in the audience, or even at this table, have ever heard of Sylvia Crowell? Sylvia Crowell was 19. Has anybody ever heard of Colleen O'Connor? Colleen was 17. How about Ben Grant? Ben Grant was 17. Marge Kohlberg. Marge Kohlberg was 50 years old. Have you ever heard of any of them? Of course you haven't. Have you ever heard of Nathan Dunlap? Mm-hmm. Of course you have. Nathan Dunlap's the person that killed those people that I just mentioned. So one of the injustices that I think that we have with the death penalty, especially the way it's not carried out in Colorado, is that we almost create some kind of an iconic figure of those that are on death row, such as Nathan Dunlap. And we forget about the real victims that were murdered and that paid the price through Nathan Dunlap's actions. We don't hear those names, but we hear Nathan Dunlap over and over and over again. And we're going to hear about him a lot. As Governor Hickenlooper leaves office, I think he has to make a big decision. Is he going to grant some type of clemency? Is he going to make his reprieve forever? We don't know. But Nathan Dunlap's name will be in the news media, I promise, within the first 6 months of the new legislature and the new governor taking office. Mm-hmm. But none of those people that I just mentioned, none of them will be mentioned in the news. So I do believe the death penalty in Colorado is dead. It's on the books, but it, for all practical purposes, no longer functions in any way, shape, or form.
Okay. What is your personal involvement in this issue? Especially as we talk about Colorado, I think we have to start with the district attorney.
Well, I've been a prosecutor since 1980 here in Larimer County in the Eighth Judicial District, which covers all of Larimer and Jackson County for folks who may not be aware of that. I think the death penalty still has a place to be on the books in Colorado. I disagree when people say there will be a huge cost savings. I totally disagree with that statement. Without the death penalty, cases, first-degree murder cases in particular, where someone is facing, under current law, life without the possibility of parole, every one of those cases that might have been considered for the death penalty, if it was serious enough to consider for the death penalty, there will be no other plea bargain offered in those cases, and those cases will go to trial. And the public defender, who represents probably 85 to 90% of the criminal defendants in Colorado, their budget that they have for pursuing or defending folks on death penalty cases is just going to be shifted over, and they're going to put all those resources into now defending those facing life without the possibility of parole. It'll cost just as much. There'll actually be more of them, and the appeals that are go on now for years on the death penalty will carry on for life without the possibility of parole cases. So I don't believe there's going to be a savings.
Have we ever recently, has the DA recently charged anyone, or let's say the last 20 years, with the death penalty in Colorado, in our district?
Well, first off, and maybe it's just terminology, we don't charge anybody with the death penalty.
Okay.
We charge them with first-degree murder or
Right.
homicide. The issue is what should the penalty be? And the district attorney does have, they are the ones charged with making an election and notifying the court as to whether or not they will seek the death penalty as a penalty if successful at trial on proving the case beyond a reasonable doubt. To my knowledge, we have not had a death penalty trial in my tenure since 1980 at least. To say, though, that the death penalty hasn't come into play would not be true. I can identify at least 7 cases that, but for the death penalty being in play, a possibility, the people would not have pled guilty. But we have at least 7 cases of first-degree murder that I'm aware of in Larimer County where people pled guilty and faced a life sentence rather than go to trial and take a chance that the district attorney's office would in fact seek the death penalty.
Okay. Michael, so many of the articles do say that we would save a lot of money if we did not have the death penalty. What does your research show?
Excuse me, I've never done specific research on the cost of the death penalty, but there have been numerous studies that have been done. Those studies have been done by legislatures, by courts, by academics, and all those studies show that without the death penalty, we would be saving dump trucks filled with money. And the reason why, basically, is prison guards cost less than attorneys. Once you're sentenced to death, you might be on death row for 5, 10, 15, 20. This year, in the United States, we've had 2 people executed who were on death row more than 30 years. So it can be extremely expensive. And we also have lessons from other states. We now have 20 states in the United States that have abolished the death penalty. The last one being Washington State a couple months ago when their state Supreme Court threw out the statute. So we can look at the cost of prosecuting a first-degree murder case, let's say in Michigan that abolished the death penalty in 1847, and compare it with Colorado. And the reality is that in Michigan and Colorado, they have just about the same number of cases that go to trial. People where the evidence is solid against them, people like James Holmes, tend not to go to trial. They'll just plead it up, plead guilty, and get it all over with. So we do have lessons from 20 states in the United States about what life would be like without the death penalty.
Okay, Kevin?
Well, as a legislator, I don't have courtroom experience, and I don't have the experience of a prosecutor on that end, but I've had experience with the lawmaking side of it. And I served on the Senate Judiciary Committee for some years, was on the Sentencing Reform Interim Committee last year. And I can tell you that when we look at what should the penalties be, the real question is not really what should the punishment be as much as what can be an adequate deterrent. And what deeply concerns me, if you take away the death penalty component to our judicial system, is for the criminal who already has a life sentence, there is no penalty that you can put on them other than what they already have. And that's one concern. And the other is for those cases where the prosecutor needs that authority to say, okay, if you want to plead guilty to life imprisonment, you will avoid us pursuing this as a death penalty case. Take that away, and you're not making life simpler. You're making it much more complicated for that part of the process. For the 16 years I've been down in the legislature, I've heard this argument again and again. We're going to save money through this, and we can devote this other ways. Well, we spend $30 billion through the state of Colorado at this point, and that grows every year. We have the knowledge to address the priorities. And again, to reduce this to $1.00 savings, I was tempted to say I almost find this offensive, but I do find it offensive. Because that's not the question. The question is deterrence. The question is protecting the innocent people in Colorado. And to take away the death penalty, I believe, is a step backwards in justice and in protecting the people of Colorado.
Okay. Troy, as a defense attorney, how do you look at these issues? Have you ever defended
I've never defended. Cliff and I started actually at the same time. 1980 was the year I hired on the Fort Collins Police Department. Cliff and I have worked together for the entirety of that time for the most part. We actually the one case that I recall where the death penalty was at play that helped negotiate a plea was Mad Dog Marion Pruitt. Mad Dog Marion Pruitt shot and killed a 7-Eleven clerk at Remington and Mulberry, probably back in the early 80s, I don't know, 81, 82. He went on a murder string throughout the United States. And Stu Van Maveren at that time employed the death penalty to leverage a plea of guilty against Marion Pruitt. Marion Pruitt was ultimately convicted and put to death in Arkansas years later. So, that was one time I know that it was used effectively in Colorado. Killed 2 people in Larimer County. Neither one of us remember their names, but we remember Mad Dog Marion Pruitt, which kind of goes back to the point I made earlier that at some point the notoriety of the people that we are trying to punish goes way beyond the notoriety that is so deserving of the people that are the victims in this. Here's some numbers, though, that come out of the University of Denver. And it doesn't have dollar signs attached to it. It has days of court tied up. The average number of court days in prosecuting a death penalty case in Colorado, the average number of court days, 147.6. So let's say 148 court days to prosecute a death penalty case in Colorado. And that goes back looking at the last 6 death penalty trials in Colorado. The average court days to prosecute a life without parole first-degree murder case is 24 and a half days. And so when you put that into numbers or dollar signs, it's hard to dispute that there would be a savings if we abolish the death penalty. 147 court days is an awful lot of time and resources when you talk about judges and clerks and security, administrative staff, the lawyers, their administrative staffs, et cetera. Those are big numbers. Those are real numbers. And incidentally, of all those of the death penalty cases that were analyzed by the University of Denver, one resulted in an acquittal, one resulted in a jury verdict, life without parole. Actually, 2 of them resulted in life without parole. So with all that time spent, we ended up in the same place that we would have ended up without the death penalty.
Okay, go ahead, Cliff.
And I would submit, Troy, that while those statistics may show an average of 24 court days for a first-degree murder with life without the possibility of parole currently, if the death penalty is abolished, the resources that were previously used on those cases will be diverted to life without the possibility of parole cases. The motion practice will skyrocket on those cases, and the number of court days will skyrocket as well.
And Michael, would you agree with that? What does your research show? Well, apparently not. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel I'm the elder here. I got involved in death penalty work in 1979, so I beat both of you by a year. And during my career, I actually was trained to teach in the medical school at the University of Florida. And very quickly, I got involved in death penalty work. I've gone through last visits with 50 inmates and held the hands of the families, both of the person being executed and of the families of the homicide victim. It's a horrible experience for everybody. Interestingly enough, among those who were executed in the United States, 10% dropped their appeals. They asked to be executed. They'd rather be dead than live their life on death row. Most people who end up on death row had an opportunity to escape it had they pled guilty. For example, I worked on Ted Bundy case for 10 years. I actually had his ashes in my closet after he was executed for about 6 months, but that's another story. He was offered life in both the cases where he was sentenced to death, Chi Omega and Kimberly Leach in Florida, but he turned it down. So if the death penalty, we've spoken of the death penalty as a deterrent, there was a huge study conducted by the National Academy of Sciences in 2012, and this is the top academics in the world, really. And they looked at all the studies that have been done on the death penalty, and they concluded that the death penalty, there's no evidence to conclude that the death penalty has any greater effect on homicide rates than long imprisonment. So it's a very telling study. I think what we need to do is focus on what goals the death penalty is supposed to achieve. And if we want to reduce the homicide rate, let's talk about that. Maybe we need more police officers. Maybe we need more programs for to assist battered women, something like that. There's a number of different things that we can do. If the death penalty is supposed to assist families of homicide victims, why don't we talk to families of homicide victims? 40% of the homicides in Colorado and in the United States today aren't even solved. And if you talk with a random sample of families of homicide victims, they want to know what happened to their loved one. That's the number one priority. And indeed, in 2009, a group of families of homicide victims gathered together to abolish the death penalty. And it wasn't because they hated the death penalty. It was because they wanted that money to go to cold case squads to find out who had killed their loved one. Justice before vengeance was their motto.
I see. Okay. Now, we did talk a little bit about the death penalty, and you mentioned it being a deterrent. If there's no deterrent, why do we have it? Or why isn't it a deterrent? The people just don't care? Troy, do you have if you're defending criminals, what's their motivation? Or lack of motivation to avoid, why do they commit crimes if they worry about death or they don't worry?
Well, I think generally speaking, crime is committed because there's opportunity and there's motive. I think that's kind of what you learn at the basics of Crime Prevention 101. A person will commit a crime if there's a motive and there's opportunity to commit the crime. I don't know of any statistics or any studies that have been done. I know they have. I'm not familiar with them as I sit here. But I would probably say that everybody on death row did not contemplate a sentence to death at the time they committed the murder that brought them to the death chamber. So the deterrent effect, with all due respect, is nearly laughable. I mean, Nathan Dunlap, sitting on death row for murders that occurred in 1993. I'm not sure what the deterrent effect is, and the analogy that's often used is, well, if a child sticks their finger in a light socket, they get shocked, they'll know not to stick their finger in a light socket again, and that's the deterrent effect. I'm not sure sticking my finger in a light socket and then 23 years later or beyond getting a sting would necessarily deter me from sticking my finger in a light socket again. Mm-hmm. There is no deterrent effect whatsoever in the death penalty. Senator Lundberg and Cliff have alluded to probably the most arguable point to keeping the death penalty, and that is that it gives prosecutors some sort of a tool to try to leverage a plea in a homicide case for efficient and speedy justice. And that's probably true.
Is it?
I believe it is, and I agree with Troy on that. I don't think that there's a huge deterrent effect for the general public for the death penalty. I think there is a deterrent effect for those who may already be in prison serving a life sentence. If you have no death penalty, it's basically open season on prison guards and other inmates. And is it really fair to other inmates when there's somebody in their life without the possibility of parole and they can victimize other inmates and murder them? I mean, if you do a search, you can come up with it. There's one here that the defendant was serving a life sentence for murder. He killed his cellmate viciously, and he stated, quote, "I murdered that man cold-bloodedly. I planned it. I'm going to do it again. Somebody needs to stop it, and the only way to stop it is to put me on death row."
That wasn't in Colorado.
It was not in Colorado.
Okay.
It's a very small population, but I think that there is a deterrent effect in those limited situations. There may be a deterrent effect if somebody is thinking about shooting a police officer, if they know the death penalty might be the case. But for the general public, most of our murders are passion-induced, family-related. I would agree. I don't think there's a deterrent effect with the death penalty on those. But to say there's none in any case, I disagree with.
Okay, Kevin?
I'd like to disagree with all of you and say that, yes, there is a deterrent effect. And I want to pose this observation that somehow we put the death penalty as a deterrent that apparently doesn't work. But what about the rest of our prison sentences and our whole penal system? Is that a deterrence? Because I believe you can make an argument on just about any one of the sentencing mechanisms we have that in and of itself, we really can't find evidence that with or without, third-degree murder, there are more or less murders within that category. What I see is far too many people trying to make a case by picking and choosing their statistics let's get rid of the death penalty, theoretically, and how about life sentences? Is that appropriate? Well, you could make an argument on a moral sense that locking a human being up for the rest of their life, which could be for decades and decades, is cruel and unusual punishment. I'm not suggesting that, but I'm saying that you could make as big an argument there, and my concern is that we've somehow isolated this one component of our justice system and saying, no, we can't do that. And I'll add this one final point here. I find it very curious that within this whole realm of what's appropriate justice and appropriate laws, that the legislature has rushed forward with, and frankly through some ballot initiatives as well, the people of Colorado, to allow assisted suicide. And there are far too many components to the law that really lean pretty close to euthanasia in many cases. And the life of the unborn is completely fair game. But somehow a heinous murderer is held harmless from the death penalty. I just don't agree with the whole logic I'm seeing put forth here. Thank you.
Okay, Michael?
Yes, I think what we need to do is look at people who are in prison who do kill and what happens to them. They're miserable. They're made much more miserable if they commit any offense while they're in prison. About a year ago, I visited Edward Montour, who was on death row here in Colorado for killing a prison guard. He's now in Waupun, Wisconsin, and I went up there to visit him, and it was behind, I knew it was going to be behind glass. I wouldn't have contact, but it was on TV. And I had to go all the way to Waupun, Wisconsin to see this guy who's like 2 doors down the hallway because they wouldn't even let us sit in front of each other in glass. There are all sorts of ways to make life really, really miserable for lifers who disobey prison rules. They have something called confinement loaf in Florida, where basically you take everybody's meal for the day and you put it in a blender and heat it up, and that's all you get. That's all the food you get. There are restrictions about always being handcuffed, no recreation, limited visits. The first thing that might go is visits with your family, which are the most important things. So it turns out that if we look at behavior in prisons, lifers are the most well-behaved. They tend to be a little bit older, and they also know that if they do anything wrong, they really get in trouble.
I have a question for you. I read a Canadian report, or a summary of it, that said in Canada, by abolishing the death penalty, they reduced murders by 44%. Can you comment on that?
Well, we know that there's an article this morning in the New York Times, as we tape this now in December, that said that the United States this year is going to have one of the lowest homicide rates in, I think, a couple decades. So the homicide rate goes up and down, really independent of what happens in the criminal justice system. So let's talk about what we can do to reduce the homicide rate. I mean, that's the goal. You know, if I had the piles of money that we're spending on the death penalty, I would build battered women's shelters. I would take care of children who were born with PTSD. About 10% of those on death row were born with PTSD. We can talk about psychological treatment for kids, early intervention. There's all sorts of things that we could do. We could hire more police officers. All sorts of things we can do to reduce the homicide rate that would be more effective than taking one guy, putting him in a cage, Nathan Dunlap since 1993, and then someday taking him out and putting him out of his misery on the gurney. It's nonsensical, and there is not a criminologist in the United States today, or at least a credible one, who's arguing the death penalty has a greater deterrent effect than life without parole. Let me make one more point. The question of the deterrent effect of the death penalty is not the deterrent effect per se. If there was a death penalty for illegal parking, I would park my car in a different spot tonight. The question is over and above life imprisonment. Okay? Is there a deterrent over and above life imprisonment? Every state with the death penalty, if you're not sentenced to death, you're sentenced to life without parole. And it's sort of like if you want to deter people from leaning on the stove, medium heat works just as well as high heat. You know, after a while, increases in the severity of the punishment do not add to its deterrent effect.
Okay, Troy.
Well, when we talk about the deterrent effect, and going back to Cliff's example, so we have somebody that's serving a life without parole sentence in prison, what incentive is there for them not to commit other crimes? And the incentive may be that if you do, there's a chance you'll be sentenced to death and ultimately be executed. That's the carrot, that's the stick effect. We never talk about the carrot effect. And the carrot effect used to be life sentence was 20 years, and then it went to 40 years, and then I think it went to 60 years, and then it went to absolute life without the possibility of parole. So at one time, there was an incentive for somebody who was serving a life sentence to behave, to not commit new crimes, because the incentive was you might get out at some point in time. We've taken that away. And because we've taken that away, we now have no options but the threat of execution. And so one of the things that the legislature, I wish, would contemplate is going back to incentivizing some sliver of hope for every individual that's in prison. And that hope might be that when I turn 80, I might get to walk free again if I do well. But to put somebody in prison with zero hope whatsoever, I think lends itself to a violent criminal becoming more violent and out of control.
Okay, what about the protective effect? Isn't the idea of putting someone in prison to protect the public? And so I don't know where you land on that, but if you said someone committed murder when they were 20 years old, maybe when they were 80, they were no longer a danger to the public. And at some point, somebody has to decide that, I guess. Is that the way it should work, District Attorney?
Well, I think so. I mean, let me take you back real quick to June 21st of 2017 here in Fort Collins. A young female at 109 leaves the McDonald's over on Elizabeth, walking home after working at McDonald's to try and make a living. As she's crossing through City Park, a previously convicted sex offender living as a transient in Fort Collins kidnapped her, brutalized her, beat her, sexually assaulted her, filmed it on his phone, and he's heard on his phone yelling, "I'm raping this," and then he used an epithet for her. "I'm raping her." He not only did it when she was alive, he then killed her, and he raped her again, her corpse, a previously registered sex offender. I'm sorry, Mr. Krenning, I don't want that person to have a sliver of hope to ever get out. And quite frankly, I want to have the death penalty as an option in those sorts of extreme cases. So anyhow, we may just agree to disagree.
So why wasn't the death penalty sought in that case?
because there was an agreement to plead guilty to the life without the possibility of parole, and the family did not want to go through the years of appeals, and by getting a plea, then he waived his right to appeal. So all those factors came into effect.
And with plea bargaining, it's not an artifact of the death penalty per se, it's an artifact of the maximum sentence. So if somebody's looking at life without parole, they might bargain down to life with parole eligibility after 40, 50 years. There are, I was in a prison in Miami in September. It's an old people's prison. You have to be 55. I don't like that definition, but in any event, it was pathetic. All these old people walking around with, some in hospital gowns, in wheelchairs. And I have to say, I've been in prisons, maximum security prisons all over the world, hundreds of times. And this was the first time I was ever injured by a prisoner because he ran his wheelchair over my foot accidentally, but it hurt. You know, these are not, when you get to be 70, 80, 90 years old, as some prisoners are, these are not people who are especially dangerous.
I'd like to jump in and observe something that I see moving on the discussion here. That is, if we get rid of the death penalty and then we consider reducing prison sentences to something less than life without parole, wow, we're going a very different direction. And I would also observe that when there was that component of shorter sentences, there was the death penalty in place as well. True. It didn't, go away until what was it, 72, right. I believe, here in Colorado. I think this is a dangerous direction. I think we're just missing the whole flow of what justice and deterrence and what the duty of the state is to protect the people of Colorado. It's not by eliminating all of the penalties in a wholesale fashion, and I fear we're really perilously close to that. And understand, I'm not seeking to eliminate the laws. I want to keep our eye on the protection of the people of Colorado first and foremost, and justice. And I don't think justice is just some ethereal, vague thing out there. I believe it's a solid concept and principle that needs to be held to. And within that context, I do support the death penalty for the most heinous of crimes.
Okay, Michael?
Yes, justice is a moral concept. It's an ethical concept. And when we look to the leaders in our state and in the country and in the world about what is moral, we find that virtually every major religion in the United States stands opposed to the death penalty. Earlier this year, the Pope, and you can call the Pope what you will, but don't call him a liberal, he took away all questions in Catholic doctrine about whether or not the death penalty is acceptable. Totally unacceptable in all circumstances. That's true of the Episcopal Church, Lutheran Church, Methodist Church, and different denominations of the Jewish.
Well, I'd like to, I don't think we should turn this into a strictly biblical discussion on theological principles, but I would strongly disagree that it's as unified an opinion as you present it, and particularly if you take any religious tradition that is based on biblical values, you'll find that they may have that opinion, but it's very much in contrary to what is taught in the Scriptures.
Well, there's probably no more issue in American politics today where more religious leaders agree than on the immorality of the death penalty. There's a website readers will be interested, the Death Penalty Information Center, DPIC, DPIC.org, and they've got the statements from all these religious leaders opposing the death penalty. Remember a couple of years ago, the Pope went to Washington, and in the Senate, he appealed to the senators to abolish the death penalty in the United States. So it's a factual statement that the leaders of most major religions in the United States stand opposed to the death penalty.
I'll simply say that we will definitely disagree on your analysis and your statements of fact as you present them.
Okay, I think we have a question. Mary
It
Dietrich.
is an interesting moral discussion, but it's also a moral discussion for the people who serve on the juries of these cases. So, I think that enters into both the practical side of the death penalty and the individual morale consensus of the jury. Is it becoming more and more difficult to convince jurors that the death penalty is a reasonable and just decision to make? When you look at the death penalty has been asked for many times in Colorado, how many times have jurors said, okay, do it? And is it becoming more and more difficult to find juries who are willing to consider the death penalty?
Okay, who can tackle that? Troy?
Well, I think that's an interesting observation. And if you look at the Holmes trial, James Holmes trial, the Aurora Theater shooter, and the amount of time and energy resources that went into that with the ultimate objective of the prosecution to obtain a death penalty conviction, and that they failed. And they failed because the 12 people that had to make that decision could not come to a unanimous decision. I think it does touch on what do individuals really think when they're put on the line and called to make that decision? And we're seeing that more and more in Colorado, where juries are reluctant to go all the way and authorize death. Contrary to that, though, are public opinion polls, where you're anonymous in your home and you get a call and random sampling, and it still seems to favor that Coloradoans support the death penalty. And they are declining. But I think what's different about polling and real world is it's one thing to sit in your home, talk on a telephone anonymously and give an opinion. It's another to be on the line and have to be one of 12 to say, I support the death of that person. And they don't do it. And I think that speaks about the public sentiment. And I think it speaks about the individual morality of people called to jury service having to make or being put in a place to make that tough decision.
Michael?
Can I say, in this century, since January 1st, 2000, the death penalty has been sought in Colorado 25 times. 3 of those are pending. Of the 22 that are completed, only 1 person was sentenced to death. And his conviction later was thrown out. That's Edward Montour, and he was resentenced to life. Again, in that case, the father of the victim was going up and down the lineup of 3,000 jurors down in Castle Rock with a big sign saying, "Please don't kill the man who killed my son." So the death penalty is, many are called, but few are chosen. And we're spending tons of money on these cases that don't result in death. And I might add one other point here, which in Fort Collins, most people will remember. Every once in a while, we make a huge blunder, like Timothy Masters, living, breathing human being, convicted of a murder that was committed when he was, 15 or 16? He was a high school student, sentenced to life without parole, did about 10 years. And then, as I think most citizens in Fort Collins know, since you're paying the tab, the city of Fort Collins eventually got sued, and they settled for $10 million. The city and county together settled for $10 million wrongful conviction, and he's exonerated. He's alive and well and living in the community.
Okay, the other thing that I think we need to discuss is the death penalty given to people, or not the penalty, the charge, or however you said it, Mr. District Attorney. Do we have evidence that show that those who are poorer, less educated, have less money to defend themselves, are they more likely to get this possibility of the death penalty than other people? Is it applied equally across the board?
Well, I think it depends. I think that may vary at different places across the country. I can tell you that here in Larimer County, since 1980, people have not been treated disparate. We've not sought the death penalty on anybody. So I don't believe that that's the case. I'm sure there are studies out there that Professor, I'm sure, can cite to that indicate that it can be documented it is. But I think that may depend on different parts of the country.
Yeah,
I just want
Michael?
to make the point that the number one predictor of who is sentenced to death nationally in different states is the race of the victim, not the race of the defendant. Here in Colorado, we have 3 people on death row. They're all young African-American males, and they went to the same high school, right? Geographic variation, it's Arapahoe County, and that counts if you have a particularly, what should we say, aggressive prosecutor. Right now, Beth McCann, the DA down in Denver, has said that she'll never pursue a death penalty. Stan Garnett, our former DA in Boulder, and the current DA both said they'll never pursue a death penalty. So race and region matter a lot in who gets to go to death row in Canyon City.
Troy, what's your observation on that?
Well, I agree with the professor, at least in Colorado, with the small number of people that we currently have on death row, 3, it is just almost an astonishing fact that all 3 of them currently on death row grew up in the same community, went to the same high school. Their crimes are very unrelated. Nathan Dunlap and the 2 Sir Mario Owens and Robert Ray went to the same high school from the same area. So in Colorado, you can easily say that being sentenced to death is directly contributed to your race and the place that the murder and the crime occurred. Nationally, the statistics bear out that it's not so disparate between the races, but in Colorado, just a simple observation and anecdotally, you would have to say that if you are black and you are committed of a murder in the Denver metro area, particularly Arapahoe County, your chance of being sentenced to death is exponentially greater, to 100% exponentially greater than, say, if that same individual were to commit the same crime in Cliff's jurisdiction. I believe that.
I'd have to say that to take a subset of 3, or a full set of 3, that you're really in the anecdotal category and not in the statistical analysis, so to draw any conclusion out of that would be extremely problematic.
Well,
I think the other thing is you need to be aware that 2 of those kids who went to the same high school conspired to commit the murder of 2 witnesses who were had testified or were about to testify in a previous murder case. So 2 of your 3 were involved with trying to obstruct justice and murder witnesses from a previous murder case. So does that have more factor of why they went for the death penalty there versus their race? I would say so.
Michael?
Senator Lundberg is quite correct. You can't really draw generalizations based on 3 people. So we've gone back to 1980 and looked at every time in Colorado where the death penalty has been sought. It's about 130 cases now. So we've got a bigger sample of that. Of those, 1 still is, 3 are still on death row. But of those 110, that's where the race of victim comes in. So race of defendant does not matter all that much. It's the race of victim that's predictive. And I mentioned the innocence thing. This is out of context, but if I could throw this out too. One of the things we've learned in the last few years, Colorado is one of the few states in the country that now has admitted that one of the people who we executed was innocent. That man's name was Joe Riedel, a Syrian immigrant who was executed in 1939. And Governor Bill Ritter, a former prosecutor, no liberal, on one of his last acts as governor in 2012, granted Joe Riedel a posthumous pardon. So that doesn't happen all that often, but we've got that history in Colorado.
Did you have a comment?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
Ask a question.
Good, good. Well, I'm wondering if there are any more audience questions or people have any more comments. I have one last question that I will ask you. And yes, Sue Ellen.
I'd like to ask Senator Lundberg, when you were on the Judiciary Committee, what kinds of arguments do you hear from people testifying? Are these arguments, are they primarily in terms of retribution? Are they in terms of cost? Do you get people who have been victimized or who are closely related to people who are victimized? What's the scope of arguments that you hear? I mean, I know that's not a valid sample of public opinion. It's self-selecting, but I just wonder if they tend towards more practical or if they are almost all on the moral and side of retribution.
Well, understand, if you're talking about discussions about the death penalty, there have been very few bills actually dealing with that. The only one I'm aware of is a bill that I carried. And it was to deal largely with the question that was posed earlier about juries agreeing that somebody is guilty. Understand, this is how the death penalty system works within the courts. In that first there's a trial as to guilt or innocence, and then there's a second part to that trial where they consider the penalty. Will it be a death penalty or not? The first degree murder is determined first, and so my bill was trying to address the issue of the dilemma you have when a court or a jury says you're guilty of first degree, but then obviously one juror is not going to go for the death penalty in even the most heinous of crimes. Now, to address your question, it did cover the gamut as far as the arguments given. I mean, it's very difficult when you are listening to public testimony to really sort out how this translates into the overall opinion of people. And as a legislator, really your job is to consider what's being heard in public testimony. But again, there isn't enough data there to really draw a solid conclusion. It's more the values and principles you carry with the combined wisdom of everybody else on the committee and ultimately the body in the House and the Senate that make the final determination. I wish I could give you a much more specific, clear answer, but that's as clear as it gets.
Okay, then for your last comments, why don't you tell us what advice you would give to the state legislature if and when a bill comes up to abolish the death penalty? And why don't we start with our district attorney?
Well, succinctly, I'd say don't do it. I think that the death penalty in Colorado is severely restricted. As the numbers show, it's rarely sought, and even when sought, rarely does a jury find it. I don't think there's a huge misuse of it on the books in Colorado, but I think it does have an effect. I think there is a deterrent effect for certainly those already serving a life sentence. Might be small, but I think it would be a mistake to eliminate it. And when the issue comes up, I would urge folks to be cautious when you hear we're going to save money and we could use it for battered women. We could use it for these noble causes. There's a lot of things we could save money on and use for those noble causes, for battered women or whatever. We could eliminate subsidies for solar energy if you wanted. So those things, I think, are emotional things that pull away from the real issue, and I just urge people caution when you hear those sorts of things.
Okay, Michael, what would you advise them?
Well, when I got out of graduate school in 1977, there were 16 countries around the world that had abolished the death penalty. 16. Today there's 104. And the leading executioners in the world are not countries that we usually share our human rights policy with. China, Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Egypt. Those are the leading countries, along with the United States, in the number of death sentences. Public support for the death penalty is dropping like a rock. If you ask people if they support the death penalty, in theory, they might support it, but if you say given the option of life without parole, support for the death penalty goes down rather precipitously. The number of executions in the United States has been declining since 1999. The number of new death sentences and the number of prosecutors who are actively seeking death sentences has all been dropping. Since the modern death penalty began in 1972, since then, the following states have abolished the death penalty: Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, New Mexico, Illinois, Connecticut, Maryland, Delaware, Washington, even Nebraska abolished it, at least temporarily. I mean, Nebraska, they're not liberal. The football team is red. You know, everything is conservative in that state. But they voted to abolish the death penalty. The governor vetoed it. The legislature overrode that veto. It finally went to a ballot. The governor's family pumped a lot of money into it and it lost. But the clear historical direction around the world is to abolish the death penalty. And I think we'd be doing a great service to the name of Colorado if we join the world community to abolish the death penalty.
Okay. Kevin, what would you tell them?
Well, it's interesting that this be the kind of the final question to me, because as a term-limited state senator, all I have left to give is advice
That's
rather
right.
than a vote. And my advice is this. I understand the political realities of what legislature will be sitting in this next year. I believe they ought to address this to the people. They ought to refer it. If this is a big question that they want to tackle, I am agreeing with our district attorney that they shouldn't do it. I don't believe so. I'd vote no. Mm-hmm. But given the circumstances of today, I think the most credible statement they can have is to refer it to the people and let them decide. If that's such a, if the opinion is dropping like a rock, then put it up to the people to decide.
Okay, Troy.
Briefly, my advice to the legislature would be this. We're talking about the death penalty. The death penalty is the headliner, but the real story is criminal justice reform in total. And it's not just a Colorado thing, it's a national thing. There are a number of problems with our criminal justice system that need serious attention. They need serious people to sit down and provide input. The death penalty should be abolished. It's outlived whatever possible usefulness it has ever had. There is a financial savings. Whether or not those financial savings would be diverted to more public defenders, throwing more motions at more cases in court, or whether they would be thrown to noble causes such as the professor highlighted, I have no idea. But the fact is there would be a savings of money and those resources would be devoted elsewhere. We got a lot of problems in addition to the death penalty. My advice to the legislature is start fixing them one piece at a time, please.
Okay, thank you to our panelists for a most interesting and informative discussion. We also thank our studio and viewing audience, and we hope that you will encourage others to watch our program if they're interested in this issue. This and other CrossCurrents programs are available on the League of Women Voters website, the Fort Collins TV channels 14 and 881. It is also available on YouTube. You search the City of Fort Collins or fcgov.com and look for the link to YouTube. Thanks again.